In the bitter winter of 1849, a 14-year-old girl named Emma Fitzgerald convinced an entire Massachusetts town that she could speak to the dead. For 3 long months, desperate families lined up outside a modest Catholic church in Millbrook, clutching silver coins and tear-stained letters, begging the pale Irish girl with the haunting green eyes to deliver messages from those they had buried. But the townspeople didn't know the truth. Emma's so-called gift wasn't divine. It came from something far more calculated and far more sinister. The Fitzgerald family had spent years perfecting a deception so intricate, so cruel that when the truth finally came to light, it would shatter not only the townspeople's faith, but their will to live. The records of what really happened in that lonely New England village were buried by church authorities for over a century, sealed away in hidden archives. Inside them lay a story of manipulation, betrayal, and darkness that consumed a community from within. It began, as most tragedies do, quietly. Millbrook, Massachusetts, was a humble mill town of barely 800 souls, nestled between frozen streams that powered the textile factories where most residents toiled from dawn to dusk. The air reeked of dye and processed wool. Machinery clattered endlessly through the valley, echoing against the snow-draped hills. The winters there were cruel. Snow turned narrow dirt roads into slick, impassable trails of mud and ice. For months, the town was cut off from the outside world, its people bound together by necessity, routine, and isolation. 5 years earlier, St. Bridget's Catholic Church had been grudgingly accepted into this Protestant stronghold. It was built from the bones of an abandoned Presbyterian meeting house, purchased outright by a tall, imposing Irish priest named Father Cornelius Fitzgerald. His arrival had raised eyebrows. Few understood how a simple immigrant clergyman could afford such a transaction, let alone bring with him an air of wealth and quiet power. But the people of Millbrook were desperate for spiritual leadership, and so they overlooked the mystery. Father Fitzgerald stood over 6 feet tall, lean and severe, his silver-streaked hair catching light like fine wire. His eyes, cold, piercing blue, seemed to look straight through a person. His accent carried the gentle lilt of County Cork, softened into something almost aristocratic. He had crossed the Atlantic after the Great Famine, accompanied by his brother's family and a single iron-bound trunk that never left his chambers. In Millbrook, Father Fitzgerald became both comforter and enigma. When cholera swept through the mill workers' quarters, he moved among the dying with fearless devotion. He delivered last rites, prayed with widows, and carried messages between parents and their fevered children. He always seemed to know what words would soothe a breaking heart. To the townspeople, that made him holy. To those who looked deeper, it made him dangerous. Living beside him in the rectory was his brother's daughter, Emma. She was a delicate girl with prematurely streaked hair and a face too pale for her age. Her green eyes held the kind of sadness that silences rooms. When she arrived, she did not speak a single word. They said she had survived horrors on the voyage from Ireland, that she had watched her parents die of ship fever and starvation, and that the trauma had taken her voice. The people pitied her, the silent orphans sweeping church floors, tending herbs behind the rectory, and moving through life as though trapped in some faraway place. Her aunt, Martha Fitzgerald, was the opposite, sharp-eyed, hard-faced, her hands calloused and strong. She managed the household with ruthless order. Known for her herbal remedies and skill in childbirth, she earned reluctant respect from the Protestant women who otherwise distrusted her faith. Her husband, Patrick, worked at the sawmill, a broad-shouldered man with the kind of strength and humility that made people talk freely in his company. They thought him simple, loyal, trustworthy. He was anything but. For 5 years, the Fitzgeralds had been watching Millbrook, listening, cataloguing. Every confession whispered in Father Fitzgerald's booth was recorded, not as a matter of faith, but of leverage. The priest wrote in neat Gaelic script, documenting the townspeople's sins, debts, infidelities, fears, and secrets. None of them could read it, and he preferred it that way. The family was patient. They knew grief was the purest currency. All they had to do was wait for the right death, the right mother. the right moment to begin. That moment arrived on a bitter February morning. The church was crowded despite the cold, the congregation's breath hanging in white clouds as they huddled together for warmth. Father Fitzgerald stood in the pulpit, preaching about eternal rest. Outside, the wind howled through cracks in the old stone walls. Among the crowd sat Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson, a woman known for her composure. She had lived in Millbrook 15 years, and she had buried her 6-year-old son, Thomas, just 3 weeks before. The scarlet fever had taken him quickly, too quickly. As the priest's voice echoed through the church, Eleanor's restraint gave way. A deep animal wail broke from her chest, shaking the very air. She wept uncontrollably, her cries mingling with the creak of pews and the shuffling of uneasy feet. Even the toughest mill workers lowered their eyes. Father Fitzgerald left the pulpit, his tone softening, his words low and rhythmic like a lullaby. He reached her pew just as something impossible happened. At the very back of the church, Emma Fitzgerald spoke. For 5 years, she had been mute. The town had almost forgotten the sound of her existence. But her voice, clear, gentle, and oddly melodic, cut through the air like a blade. Thomas says not to cry, Mama. He says the angels are teaching him to read, just like you always wanted. The church froze. Even the wind seemed to stop outside. Emma's voice sounded too mature for her age. Her face glowed faintly in the candlelight, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her head tilted slightly, as though she were listening to words whispered in her ear. He says to tell you about the wooden horse he carved for Christmas. She continued softly, the one hidden under the floorboards. He says he finished it just before the fever took him. He wants little Mary to have it. Mrs. Hutchinson went pale. The wooden horse was real. Thomas had carved it in secret, hiding it under loose floorboards in his room. She had found it after his death and told no one, not even her husband. A murmur rippled through the church. Emma's eyes fluttered closed, then opened again, shining with tears that caught the firelight. He says to remember the song you sang when the storms came, the one about the sailor finding his way home by the stars. He says he can still hear you sing, and it helps him not to be afraid. The lullaby had been Eleanor's secret, something she'd made up herself on sleepless nights, humming it only to Thomas when thunder rolled outside their window. The congregation held its breath. When Emma finally blinked, confusion clouded her face, as if she'd awakened from a dream she couldn't recall. Father Fitzgerald appeared stunned. For a moment his composure cracked. Then he placed a steadying hand on the girl's shoulder, voice rich with solemn awe. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he intoned, his blue eyes scanning every face in the pews. "Young Emma has been chosen, a vessel to bring comfort to those who mourn." And just like that, a miracle was born. Word spread through Millbrook before the day was over. By evening, 3 families had come to the rectory, carrying coins and family relics, pleading for Emma to speak to their dead. Each time, she delivered messages filled with details too precise to dismiss. To the Kowalski family, she revealed the location of tools their deceased father had hidden for his grandson. They found them exactly where she said they would be. To the grieving widow Sarah McKenna, she spoke of intimate memories, details of a wedding night, a whispered Irish blessing, a small scar on a shoulder that no outsider could have known. Every message was perfect, every revelation true. The town was bewitched. Families from neighboring villages began traveling to Millbrook. They brought money, heirlooms, and desperation. Each left believing they had touched the beyond. And behind the flickering candles of Father Fitzgerald's study, the family's true work began. Patrick gathered information at taverns, laughing with the workers, coaxing stories out of loose tongues about debts, rivalries, and confessions made in drunken weakness. Martha listened to gossip among women, quilting circles, birthing rooms, herbal visits. She memorized who quarreled with whom, who was unfaithful, who kept secrets buried deeper than coffins. And Father Fitzgerald orchestrated it all. His confessional became the heart of an intelligence network more meticulous than any police file. Each miracle Emma performed was built on their combined knowledge. Every trance, every trembling whisper, every tear timed perfectly to harvest both money and faith. They had crafted the performance down to an art. The candles, the scent of incense, the cool temperature of the room, all designed to draw people into belief. Emma's pale skin seemed to glow under the wavering light. Her eyes glimmered with practiced wonder. Millbrook had no idea that their beloved priest was the puppeteer and his silent niece the instrument. But schemes that feed on faith always draw scrutiny. And soon, the Fitzgeralds would attract it from the most dangerous kind. By early spring, Emma Fitzgerald had become a name whispered in reverence across New England. What began as a small-town miracle had swelled into something far larger. Families came from miles away, Boston merchants, Hartford widows, farmers from the countryside, all bringing coins, trinkets, and trembling hope. They arrived believing they were meeting a girl who could pierce the veil between the living and the dead. What they found instead was a family of predators who understood grief better than any theologian. Each session unfolded with the same solemn rhythm, the flicker of candlelight, the faint scent of myrrh. Emma sitting motionless in Father Fitzgerald's study as the priest's voice filled the room with gentle prayers. Then, without fail, the girl's eyes would glaze, her lips would part, and she would begin to speak with the voice of the lost. The effect was devastating. She could recall phrases whispered on deathbeds, describe hidden heirlooms, recite childhood jokes only the deceased would know. The details were perfect, because the Fitzgeralds had collected them all. Patrick Fitzgerald had turned the tavern into his hunting ground. He drank just enough to loosen others' tongues while keeping his mind sharp. Workers spoke freely to him, thinking they were confiding in a friend, never realizing their secrets would later echo from the mouth of a child, claiming to be a ghost. Martha's methods were subtler. She moved among the women of Millbrook like a midwife of comfort, delivering herbs, ointments, and sympathy. In exchange, she gathered intimate confessions, stories of miscarriages, affairs, buried resentments, and longings whispered over teacups. The details she remembered with uncanny precision, and at the center of it all was Father Fitzgerald, recording every confession, every rumor, every private shame. His journals, written in looping Gaelic, formed a map of the town's soul. No detail was too small. He documented which families had debts, which husbands drank too much, which wives secretly feared damnation, and which mothers still set a place at the table for children long gone. It was data, spiritual, emotional, financial, and it was power. The family used it ruthlessly. To the widow McKenna, Emma relayed a message that her dead husband had forgiven her doubts and still watched over her. The woman wept for hours and left a silver locket in thanks. To the Kowalskis, Emma described the tools their patriarch had hidden beneath barn floorboards for his grandson. They found them exactly as she said and donated their savings to St. Bridget's in gratitude. Each success fed the next. By March, the Fitzgeralds' parlor had transformed into a shrine of grief and gold. Silver crosses, pocket watches, family rings, all offerings from the desperate and the hopeful, glimmered on the shelves. Even the Protestant families, once suspicious of the Irish priest, began to cross themselves when passing the church, half in reverence, half in fear. But perfection has a way of drawing attention. Reverend Samuel Hartwell of the First Protestant Church had long dismissed Emma's miracles as Catholic superstition, yet he could no longer ignore the empty pews in his own chapel. His flock was thinning, drawn to the promise of hearing their dead loved ones speak. Hartwell was not a man easily swayed by emotion. Methodical by nature, he began keeping records. Each claim Emma made, every revelation she uttered, he compared against what was publicly known. And slowly, discrepancies emerged. Certain messages contained information that only the living could know, details shared in confidence among the townspeople, or even recent events the dead could never have witnessed. Hartwell began to suspect something calculated beneath the pious surface. He wasn't alone. Dr. Ezekiel Thorne, Millbrook's only physician, had begun to notice strange coincidences of his own. Emma's knowledge of medical details unsettled him deeply. She could describe the exact progression of an illness he'd only just diagnosed, the location of tumors invisible to the naked eye, or the specific medicines he'd prescribed in private. There was no earthly way for her to know these things unless someone had told her. He began to wonder how much the priest truly knew about his patients. Then, in late March, the first crack appeared. The McBride family came to Emma, seeking comfort for the loss of their father, a man who had died 6 months earlier in a mill accident. During their session, Emma's voice shifted, calm and sure. She claimed that their father's spirit was worried about a business deal, a lumber contract in Springfield, that would fail within the month and ruin the family. She described the contract's terms in detail, even naming the company. But there was one problem. The Springfield company hadn't even existed when Mr. McBride died. The deal she described had only been proposed weeks earlier. Timothy McBride, the eldest son, an 18-year-old with his father's shrewd mind, felt the chill of realization. His father couldn't possibly have known those details. Someone living had told Emma. When he left the church that night, Timothy didn't speak of it. But his eyes had changed. 2 days later, he ran into Dr. Thorne at Morrison's General Store. The conversation began innocently enough. Idle talk about the lingering cold, the price of flour. But when Timothy mentioned his doubts, Thorne's expression darkened. He had his own reasons for suspicion. That meeting, quiet and accidental as it seemed, marked the beginning of the end. Together, Thorne and McBride began comparing notes. At first, their investigation was cautious, private discussions, quiet observations, subtle tests. But soon a disturbing pattern took shape. Many of Emma's revelations mirrored recent confessions, medical consultations, or tavern gossip. Some families who had received messages later made decisions that benefited the Fitzgeralds directly. The widow Macready, for example, had donated her late husband's valuable tools to the church after Emma claimed he wanted them used for God's work. The Brennan family had hired Patrick Fitzgerald to rebuild their barn because their dead son allegedly requested it through Emma. The price Patrick charged was nearly double the going rate. To outsiders, these seemed like coincidences. But Thorne and McBride saw the design behind them. The two men began keeping records of their own. Thorne documented each death he treated, noting who had visited the Fitzgeralds beforehand. McBride started collecting receipts and contracts tied to the family's business dealings. Their findings were chilling. Over the past 2 years, a pattern of sudden deaths had emerged. Mostly people who had questioned the Fitzgeralds' growing influence or hinted at inconsistencies in Emma's messages. Each death appeared natural: heart failure, fever, mysterious illness. But the symptoms told another story. Thorne recognized them: small doses of poison, arsenic, mercury, plant toxins, administered slowly enough to mimic disease. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern undeniable. The first name on his list was Adelaide Hartwell, the Protestant minister's wife. She had fallen ill shortly after publicly challenging Emma's supposed miracles. Within weeks, she was dead. Stomach cramps, weakness, cardiac arrest, the classic marks of arsenic poisoning. Then came Thomas Brennan, the same young man whose spirit had urged his family to hire Patrick Fitzgerald. 2 days after expressing doubts about Emma's authenticity, he collapsed in fever and died before dawn. Thorne had treated him personally. Now he recognized the signs: mercury poisoning. The realization clawed at his conscience. He had misdiagnosed them all. And now, perhaps dozens more were dead because of his failure to see the truth sooner. The breaking point came in early April. Emma claimed to receive a message from Benjamin Fuller, a mill worker who, according to her, had died in a machinery accident. The message warned that dangerous conditions at the mill would soon claim more lives. Her words carried the exact technical details of the mill's inner workings, details only a worker would know. But Benjamin Fuller wasn't dead, he was alive, recovering from minor injuries Dr. Thorne had treated just the week before. When the doctor confronted Father Fitzgerald about it, the priest's explanation was smooth and practiced. Emma must have had a prophetic vision of Fuller's future death, he said. Perhaps the Lord had shown her what was yet to come, but the lie was too thin to hold. For Thorne and McBride, this was no longer about superstition. It was about murder. They met again that night in Thorne's study. Rain lashed against the windows as the doctor pored over his notes. Each page told the same story: poison masked as illness, manipulated faith, and a trail of money leading straight to the Fitzgeralds' door. Exposing them would mean tearing apart the fragile faith of a town built on loss. But keeping silent would mean more deaths. They both knew what they had to do. And yet, neither could have imagined how far the Fitzgeralds were willing to go to protect their empire of grief. The weeks that followed Benjamin Fuller's so-called prophecy were suffocating with tension. Millbrook seemed caught in a strange trance, half the town basking in the glow of faith, the other half whispering doubts too dangerous to voice aloud. Dr. Thorne and Timothy McBride continued their investigation in secret, meeting under the pretense of ordinary errands or evening walks. They spoke in careful tones, their words measured and cautious, aware that the Fitzgeralds seemed to have eyes everywhere. It was no illusion. Father Fitzgerald's network was woven deep into the town's daily life. Patrick heard every careless word at the tavern. Martha absorbed gossip as easily as breath. Even the church's altar boys carried tales back to the rectory without realizing the value of what they shared. Each night, Thorne studied his growing collection of notes by candlelight: names, symptoms, patterns of death. What began as a suspicion had become a map of murder, each victim linked not just by illness, but by proximity to the Fitzgeralds' supposed miracles. Still, they had no proof strong enough to convince a jury or even the sheriff. In 1849, spiritual fraud wasn't a crime, and poison left few traces a country doctor could prove. Then, one gray morning, proof arrived of its own accord. Catherine Brennan burst into Thorne's office, soaked in rain and shaking so badly she could hardly speak. In her hands she clutched a letter, its edges smeared with dirt and tears. She told him Emma had written it during a private séance just weeks earlier. According to the girl, her late husband's spirit had guided her hand directly, each word divinely dictated from beyond the grave. The message described where a cache of gold coins had supposedly been hidden on the Brennans' property, complete with exact measurements and landmarks. The promise had consumed her. She had spent nearly all her savings hiring laborers to dig, then borrowed money from Patrick Fitzgerald to continue when nothing was found. Her yard now resembled a battlefield, craters and trenches, holes deep enough to swallow a man. Every time she wanted to stop, Emma, through Father Fitzgerald, urged her on. "The treasure lies deeper," they said. "Your husband wants you to find it." Now destitute and broken, she had come to the doctor not for medicine, but for truth. Thorne took the letter gently from her trembling hands and felt his stomach turn cold. The handwriting wasn't Emma's, it was Father Fitzgerald's, meticulous, slanted, unmistakable. He had seen it in parish records, in prescription requests, in church accounts. There was no doubt. The letter was a forgery. The realization struck with the weight of revelation and disgust. This wasn't just manipulation, it was theft disguised as faith. Patrick's loan, with its predatory interest, guaranteed that Catherine would lose everything: her home, her land, her dignity, all consumed by the same family that had promised divine comfort. When she left the office, Thorne sat for a long time, staring at the letter by the flickering light of his lamp. It was a confession written in ink. He knew then that the Fitzgeralds' crimes went deeper than lies. He shared his discovery with Timothy McBride that same evening. They met behind the abandoned blacksmith's shop at the edge of town, their words nearly lost to the rising wind. When Thorne handed him the letter, Timothy's jaw tightened. "They're not just liars," he said quietly. "They're parasites." From that moment, the investigation became a crusade. They visited families who had spoken with Emma, gently probing for details: how much money had changed hands, what instructions had been given, what promises made. A grim pattern emerged. Every message from beyond seemed to lead to a financial decision that benefited the Fitzgeralds directly or indirectly. The Macready widow had donated her late husband's tools to the church. The Sullivan children had invested in supplies for Patrick's sawmill after a seance, suggested their dead father wanted them to support honest labor. Several others had mortgaged property to fund church expansions that never happened. What none of them knew was that Father Fitzgerald personally controlled every donation, recording it meticulously in coded ledgers written in Gaelic. The deeper Thorne and McBride looked, the clearer the machinery became. The Fitzgeralds weren't just con artists, they were engineers of grief, turning mourning into currency and despair into obedience. But knowledge didn't guarantee safety. The family had begun to sense the shifting air, the lingering stares, the quieter greetings, the subtle cracks in their perfect illusion. Father Fitzgerald's sermons grew sharper, more defensive. He spoke of temptation, of the devil's whispers sowing doubt among the faithful. He reminded his congregation that faith must stand firm against those who seek to destroy divine work with earthly suspicion. It sounded like a warning. Then came the night Benjamin Fuller was found dead. He had been healthy. When Thorne treated him only days earlier, his injuries from the mill nearly healed. Now he lay cold in his boarding house room, eyes glassy, skin pale with a faint bluish tint. The coroner, an inexperienced deputy, called it heart failure, but Thorne knew better. The symptoms fit too perfectly with digitalis poisoning, extracted from the foxglove plant that grew behind the rectory in Martha Fitzgerald's herb garden. It was a message written in blood. The Fitzgeralds knew. The next morning, Thorne found a small scrap of paper tucked under his office door. No name, no handwriting he recognized, just a single line written in trembling script. "You're not the only one who sees what they are. Be careful." Fear began to cling to him like the cold. Even so, he and Timothy refused to stop. They gathered everything they could: medical notes, eyewitness accounts, forged documents, and testimony from the families defrauded. When they felt ready, they turned to men who might help expose the truth: Reverend Hartwell, mill owner James Richardson, and merchant Samuel Morrison, three of Millbrook's most respected citizens. A secret meeting was arranged for April 26th in the Protestant church, the one place in town the Fitzgeralds had no authority. But the Fitzgeralds always seemed one step ahead. That night, the rain came down in sheets, rattling the church windows. Thorne and McBride arrived first, carrying their evidence wrapped in oilcloth. The others soon followed, grim-faced and tense. As they stepped into the dim sanctuary, the flickering lamps revealed two figures already seated in the front pew: Father Fitzgerald, and beside him, Emma. The priest's posture was relaxed, almost casual, his hands folded neatly on his lap. The girl beside him was trembling, tears glinting in the lamplight. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound was the rain hammering the roof. When the priest finally rose, his voice filled the room like smoke, measured, calm, disturbingly gentle. "I know why you've come," he said, "and I know what you think you've discovered. But before you destroy everything this town holds sacred, I want you to understand the truth. What followed wasn't defense, it was revelation." He told them everything: how he and his family had chosen Millbrook because of its isolation and ignorance, how they had rehearsed their miracles in Ireland during the famine years, perfecting the art of emotional manipulation, how Emma's muteness had been a calculated lie to make her eventual miracle all the more convincing. He spoke as though describing a work of art, his masterpiece of deception. He explained how every secret, every confession, every whispered sin had been catalogued and used, how he had poisoned certain townspeople just enough to ensure Emma's predictions of illness and death came true. "We didn't predict death," he said softly, a faint smile touching his lips. "We created it. The words hit like a hammer blow. Thorne felt the air leave his lungs. Hartwell's knuckles whitened around the back of a pew. Emma sobbed beside her uncle, eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching her skirt as if she could hold herself together by force. The priest went on, detailing how his ledgers recorded every death, names, dosages, expected timelines, how the family planned to move on soon, to Vermont or New Hampshire, perhaps Ohio. Once Millbrook had been drained of both money and faith, the room spun with disbelief. Then, outside the church, the faint glow of lanterns began to move through the rain. Word of the meeting had leaked, carried by whispers and fear. Within minutes, the building was surrounded by townspeople, some clutching torches, others standing motionless in the downpour, faces pale and blank. Through the windows, Thorne saw familiar faces, the Kowalskis, the Brennans, women who had buried children, men who had begged for messages from beyond. Father Fitzgerald's calm finally cracked. The control that had defined his every gesture faltered as he realized the confession he'd meant for a few would now become public. The church doors creaked open. Cold air and rain rushed in, carrying the murmur of the crowd. The priest's voice, once smooth and commanding, hardened into something desperate. "You think you can judge me?" he shouted, his accent thickening into its raw Irish edge. "You weep for the dead. But it was your faith that made this possible. You begged to be deceived. You wanted to believe more than you wanted the truth." The words bounced off the stone walls, but no one answered. The townspeople stood in stunned silence. Some cried. Others simply stared at the man they had once called their shepherd, unable to reconcile faith with horror. And through it all, Emma stood frozen beside him. The confrontation in Millbrook's Protestant church became a moment that would divide the town's history in two. Everything before it, and everything after. The rain that night fell harder than anyone could remember. The thunder of it on the roof mixed with the murmur of voices, the creak of boots in the mud, the soft weeping of those who had gathered outside. Inside, the priest who had ruled the town's soul stood cornered by the truth. Father Fitzgerald's final attempt at control came through his words. He wanted to twist guilt back onto his victims, to make them believe their need for comfort had birthed their own deception. But the power that had once made his sermons magnetic was gone. Every syllable sounded hollow against the weight of what he'd confessed. The crowd began to press closer, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight, eyes burning with disbelief, grief, and rage. Mothers who had handed over their last coins for messages from dead children. Husbands who had watched wives waste away under the priest's poison, believing it was the will of God. Dr. Thorne and Timothy McBride stood between the priest and the growing crowd, unsure whether they were protecting him or restraining him from a mob that might tear him apart. Emma clung to the edge of a pew, soaked hair plastered to her face, her body trembling. Every breath came like a sob she didn't know how to release. She had been the vessel through which the dead spoke, and now the same voices were turning into accusations in the eyes of the living. When the sheriff arrived, an aging man named Bernard Holt, he didn't ask questions. The fear in his eyes said he already knew that no single jail cell could contain what this night had unleashed. Still, he did his duty. Father Fitzgerald, Patrick and Martha were taken from the church in silence. The townspeople parted to let them pass, their faces ghostly under the glow of lanterns. No one shouted, no one cursed. It was worse than that. Only quiet, heavy breathing and the sound of the rain washing filth from stone. Emma followed last, guided gently by Dr. Thorne. She looked too small to belong to the scene, too fragile to bear the weight of so much ruin. That night, Millbrook didn't sleep. The sheriff locked the three adults in separate cells in the small stone jail at the edge of town. He posted 2 deputies outside the door and sent for the county magistrate. In a world where witchcraft trials were fading memories, no one quite knew what laws could define crimes like these. By morning, the news had spread across every house and mill in Millbrook. The church bells remained silent, the streets filled with townspeople who didn't speak so much as breathe the same stunned air, each one trying to understand how faith had been turned into a weapon. The evidence gathered by Thorne and McBride was overwhelming. Medical notes, forged letters, coded journals, testimonies from those deceived. The ledger, recovered from the rectory, contained detailed records of every act the family had committed. It was a scripture of corruption. Each page was filled with names, dates, poisons, and payments. Notes about which families were most susceptible to emotional suggestion. Exact dosages for arsenic and mercury. Instructions on when to deliver prophecies to match the effects of illness. It even documented plans for expansion, lists of other towns, potential recruits, and a chilling line written in Father Fitzgerald's steady hand. Faith, once corrupted, multiplies like disease. The ledger alone could have damned him in any court, but there would never be a trial. On the third night of their imprisonment, the jailer found all three Fitzgeralds dead in their cells. The cause, arsenic poisoning. How they obtained the substance remained a mystery. Some said they had smuggled small doses into the jail before their arrest, hidden inside the lining of their priestly garments. Others whispered that someone in town, someone who had lost too much, had slipped the poison to them, serving justice in the only language they understood. The sheriff's report called it suicide. Few believed it. Whatever the truth, their deaths ended the legal process before it could begin. The town, robbed of vengeance by the swiftness of poison, turned its sorrow inward. Emma remained the only living Fitzgerald. The question of what to do with her divided Millbrook more bitterly than any sermon or scandal. Some saw a child manipulated and enslaved by her family, a girl too young to understand the evil she had been forced to perform. Others saw her as the instrument of their humiliation, a mouthpiece for lies that had desecrated their dead. When questioned, Emma spoke little. Her voice was soft, flat, stripped of the strange power it once held, but her statements painted a picture of horror that silenced even her harshest critics. She described years of isolation, of rehearsing false prophecies until she could repeat them without emotion. She had been punished for mistakes with confinement and silence. She had watched her uncle mix herbs and powders in the rectory kitchen, then listened as he explained which doses mimicked consumption, which caused convulsions, which made death look natural. She had been told these deaths were divine will, that the pain of others was proof of God's favor on their family, that she was chosen for a sacred purpose too important to question. By the time she realized it was all a lie, she no longer knew how to speak the truth. Dr. Thorne argued for mercy. He told the sheriff and magistrate that Emma was a victim, not a conspirator, that she bore the marks of trauma no child could endure willingly. Others disagreed. The widows whose husbands had died under Fitzgerald's poison demanded she be punished. The mothers who had fallen to their knees before Emma's fake visions saw her as a demon in a girl's skin. The final decision was a compromise between justice and conscience. Emma would not stand trial. Instead, she would be sent away, far from Massachusetts, far from the shadow of her name. Distant relatives in Pennsylvania agreed to take her in under a new identity. The condition was clear. She was never to return to New England. When she left Millbrook, escorted by Dr. Thorne, not a single townsperson came to the station. No farewells, no blessings, only the whisper of rain on the roof of the carriage as it carried her away. The physical remnants of the Fitzgerald's deceit were systematically erased. Church, authorities and local officials worked together to destroy every trace of their operation. The rectory was burned for structural safety, though everyone knew it was to cleanse the land of what it had harbored. The coded journals were ordered destroyed, but Thorne secretly copied several pages before they met the fire, unable to let history disappear completely. St. Bridget's Church became a place of argument. Some wanted it demolished entirely. Others argued that tearing it down would be like burying evidence of their pain. In the end, the building was stripped of every religious symbol and converted into a town hall. Even that didn't last. No one could work within those walls without feeling watched. Strange echoes lingered in the rafters, like voices caught in stone. The building was abandoned within a decade, left to rot under ivy and time, but the physical, Scars were nothing compared to what lingered inside the people. Millbrook's faith died the same night the Fitzgeralds did. The families who had once filled the pews never prayed aloud again. They stopped speaking of heaven, stopped visiting graves. They couldn't. To believe in a spirit world now felt like opening the door to the same darkness that had destroyed them. Within 5 years, half the population had left the town altogether, seeking new beginnings in cities where no one knew their shame. The mills suffered without workers, businesses closed, and the once bustling valley grew quiet except for the river's endless churn. The few who stayed behind carried their disbelief like a scar. They stopped trusting priests. They stopped confiding in neighbors. They kept their grief locked behind closed doors. Millbrook became a place allergic to hope. Dr. Thorne stayed, though the case had hollowed him. He worked until his hands shook too much to hold a pen, documenting every symptom and every treatment in obsessive detail. His new records were meticulous, almost manic, an attempt to make sense of chaos to ensure that no deceit could ever again hide beneath the guise of healing. His legacy would outlive him. The methods he developed, precise note-taking, clear case histories, would later influence hospitals across New England. But the man himself died quietly in 1867, never fully forgiving himself for not seeing the truth sooner. Timothy McBride left town in 1852, carrying the memories he couldn't silence. He headed west, chasing the promise of a place untouched by the ghosts of Millbrook. He found work during the California gold rush, not as a miner, but as a fraud inspector, using the same instincts that had unmasked the Fitzgeralds to expose swindlers and counterfeiters. He never married, never again entered a church. And Emma Fitzgerald, if she survived, if she lived long enough to become a woman, disappeared into history under another name. Some said she became a recluse, refusing to speak to anyone about the past. Others whispered she joined a convent, her voice finally dedicated to silent prayer. But no record of her death exists. Perhaps that's for the best. For those who remained in Millbrook, silence became the town's last religion. They had learned that belief could kill, that confession could be weaponized, and that the dead should be left in peace. The Fitzgerald name vanished from the records, erased from every monument and register. But every generation since has felt the weight of their story in the empty church lot, in the way strangers hesitate to speak of miracles, in the sense that some truths are too dangerous to resurrect. And yet, even as the town tried to bury its ghosts, one truth remained unshakable. Faith, once core time, moved on, but Millbrook never healed. Years passed, and the valley that had once echoed with the hum of the textile mills grew still. The mills shut down one by one, their great iron wheels rusting under the slow creep of moss. Houses stood empty, their shutters banging against the wind. Children stopped being born there, and graves began to outnumber the living. By the 1860s, Millbrook had become a ghost town in all but name. The few families who stayed carried the story of the Fitzgeralds like an inherited disease. It was never spoken of directly, but it haunted every silence, every wary glance exchanged between neighbors. The Catholic Church in town was gone, burned by the state under the guise of safety inspection after years of abandonment. The ashes settled into the soil, and nothing green ever grew in that patch of earth again. The locals avoided it, claiming they heard voices at night. Soft, childlike murmurs carried on the wind, sometimes weeping, sometimes whispering prayers that weren't in any scripture they knew. Those who had once sought comfort in that place now crossed themselves only out of fear. Dr. Ezekiel Thorne continued to practice medicine. though he no longer saw his work as healing in the holy sense. He documented every symptom, every heartbeat, every death with near-obsessive precision, as though he could keep chaos at bay through the order of ink and paper. His ledgers became legends among other physicians, proof that one man's guilt could birth a new kind of discipline. When he finally died in 1867, townspeople buried him at the edge of the cemetery, beside the stone wall that marked the border between sacred and unconsecrated ground. It was said he requested it that way, half in, half out, so that if heaven existed, he could still face the town he'd failed to save. Timothy McBride, far away in California, carried his ghosts in silence. His life became a mirror of the deception he had once uncovered. He worked in gold camps and mining towns, using his sharp eye to expose cheats and counterfeiters. Every time he caught one, he saw Father Fitzgerald's face in their confidence. Every liar, every fraud, every man twisting faith or greed for profit, he recognized them instantly, as if he'd been branded by their kind forever. He died alone in a boarding house room in 1875, surrounded by account books and maps, his life reduced to a single line in a mining ledger. McBride, Timothy, deceased, cause unknown. No one in Millbrook ever knew, and Emma Fitzgerald, her story vanished like smoke. The relatives in Pennsylvania who took her in kept her hidden from the world. She was said to be quiet, prone to long spells of silence, her eyes distant, her voice soft as breath. Some whispered she became a nurse during the war, tending to the dying with an uncanny calm, her hands steady as soldiers gasped their final words. Others believed she entered a convent, devoting herself to prayer in penance for the lives her family had taken. No records remained to confirm either fate, but a few letters, yellowed and unsigned, appeared decades later in an old rectory archive near Pittsburgh. Letters describing nightmares of whispering voices, of a church filled with candles that would not burn out, and of a child's hand writing words she didn't remember learning. Whether those letters were truly hers, no one could say. But the handwriting matched the trembling, slanted scrawl once found in Father Fitzgerald's own ledgers. Millbrook itself withered away. The last of its residents moved out at the turn of the century. The land was eventually absorbed by a neighboring township, its name erased from maps. The only thing left standing was the old church bell, half buried in the weeds, its bronze surface blackened by age. Travelers who found it claimed that when the wind blew right, it still gave off a low, hollow hum, as if mourning its own silence. Yet the story didn't die there. Decades later, whispers of the Fitzgerald family resurfaced in rural communities far from New England. Stories emerged of traveling priests with Irish accents, of pale girls claiming to hear the dead, of families ruined by false hope. None could be definitively traced to the original Fitzgeralds, but the similarities were enough to make scholars wonder whether someone had resurrected the method, if not the bloodline, then the design. The same techniques reappeared under new guises: seances, table rapping, spirit writing. The 19th century's great spiritualist movement carried echoes of Millbrook in every candlelit parlor and trembling seance circle. Those who studied such phenomena could trace the roots back to 1849, to a girl who was told her silence was holy and her lies divine. But Millbrook's story was buried again, locked away by church archivists who feared what it revealed. The official records disappeared into diocesan vaults labeled simply MISC, 1849 only. One copy of Dr. Thorne's notes survived, passed through generations of physicians who saw it as a warning rather than a relic. It spoke not just of poison, but of the deeper toxins that thrive in human hearts: fear, faith, and the longing to believe that love can cross the boundary of death. In the end, that was what made the Fitzgeralds' deception so powerful. They hadn't preyed on greed or vanity. They had preyed on love, and love, when twisted, becomes the most dangerous thing in the world. Years turned into decades, and the story sank into legend, told in fragments by those who stumbled upon the name Millbrook in forgotten records. Some believed Emma had truly possessed a gift, that her family had corrupted something sacred rather than invented it. Others dismissed it as one of many dark frauds from a superstitious age. But for those who have read the surviving accounts, one question remains. Did the Fitzgeralds invent their gift? Or did something older, something darker, whisper back when they first tried to fake it? After all, not every voice in the dark is imagined. Even now, those who visit the abandoned land where Millbrook once stood tell strange tales. They say that on cold February nights, the air still smells faintly of incense and burning tallow. That if you stand where St. Bridget's Church once stood and whisper the name Emma, you might hear a girl's voice in reply. Soft, trembling, and impossibly near. They say she asks a question. The same one she asked on that first winter morning when her voice broke the silence of a grieving church. Do you still believe? Maybe that's the curse Millbrook left behind. Not a haunting of ghosts, but a haunting of doubt. Because once faith has been corrupted, once it's used as a tool to wound instead of heal, it never truly dies. It lingers in the spaces where people ache for comfort, waiting to be believed again. The Fitzgeralds understood that better than anyone. They didn't just exploit grief. They learned how to feed on it. They built a religion of sorrow, one that asked nothing but devotion and gave nothing but loss. Their story isn't just history, it's a warning. Every generation has its own Fitzgeralds. They don't always wear cassocks or speak in holy tones. Some wear lab coats, some wear suits, some stand behind pulpits or cameras or screens. But the hunger is always the same. The hunger to control those who ache for meaning, to twist hope into obedience, and somewhere, there's always an Emma. A voice trembling between innocence and complicity, trained to speak words that aren't her own. Millbrook is gone, its name erased, its soil reclaimed by the earth. But every time someone promises you connection to the dead, or claims knowledge too private to be possible, or asks for faith when they should offer truth, you hear its echo. Because the story of the Fitzgerald family was never just about one town or one century. It was about the oldest bargain in human history. The exchange of grief for comfort, pain for belief, and truth for hope. That's why the church records stayed sealed for over 100 years. Not because they feared scandal, but because they feared recognition. The methods, after all, never went away. They simply changed names, and somewhere in some forgotten town, a new Emma might already be waiting, eyes green as candlelight, hands trembling over the words she's been taught to speak, her voice rising in a hush as those around her lean forward, desperate to believe that love never dies. But it does, and sometimes it kills. So if you ever hear a story like this again, of a child who can speak to the dead, of miracles that seem too perfect, too intimate, too knowing, remember Millbrook, remember the Fitzgeralds, and remember what their victims learned too late. That the most dangerous lies are the ones that sound like hope. If you enjoyed this tale of forgotten darkness, share it with someone who still believes that truth always wins, because history has a way of